The morning erupted with the sound of laughter and the sharp clatter of metal gates swinging wide open, jolting me awake from what I briefly hoped was a dream until a piercing voice shattered that illusion. Karen's voice, unmistakable and shrill, the only one capable of slicing through the calm like a rusty blade. She'd been the bane of my existence ever since she'd crowned herself president of the HOA, a title she wielded like a scepter despite my ranch existing blissfully beyond her jurisdiction, a fact she'd always ignored with infuriating glee. Throwing on a flannel and jeans, I stormed outside, my boots crunching against the gravel, only to freeze as my eyes took in the chaos. A crowd of people swarmed my private property, my sanctuary, while Karen stood at the center, arms flailing like some self-appointed monarch guiding a royal procession. Behind her, a line of sleek, expensive horses stood saddled and ready, their riders fussing with helmets, while garish banners proclaiming HOA Equestrian Gala fluttered between my barn and fence posts, without a shred of permission from me. "Karen," I bellowed, marching toward her, my voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd as my blood pressure spiked. "What the hell is going on?" She turned, flashing that smug, patronizing grin that always preceded her most outrageous nonsense, her eyes glinting with the kind of confidence only entitlement could breed. "Oh, good morning," she chirped, as if I'd just strolled into her personal fiefdom. "Isn't this wonderful? We decided to host our community's first annual equestrian event right here on your ranch. Doesn't it just bring everyone together?" I blinked, struggling to process the sheer audacity dripping from her words. "You decided," I shot back, my voice tight. "On my land, without asking?" She chuckled, waving a dismissive hand like I'd just muttered something quaint and childish. "Oh, don't be such a grump. We all know your ranch is part of the greater community, even if you refuse to pay your fair share in HOA dues." My fair share? I nearly choked on the words, but before I could unleash the tirade building in my chest, she pressed on, oblivious or uncaring. "This is private property, Karen," I said, each word clipped and deliberate. "I never agreed to this. You and your circus need to pack up and leave." Gasps rippled through the crowd, pearl-clutching HOA members acting as if I'd just spat on their sacred neighborhood spirit. Karen's pitying look was almost theatrical, her head tilting like she was soothing a tantruming toddler. "Oh, sweetheart, I understand you feel left out, but this is a community event. We sent out flyers and everything. We're doing this for the good of everyone." I glanced around, spotting HOA loyalists sipping lemonade from a table they'd set up, snapping selfies in front of my barn like it was some elite country club instead of the working ranch I'd poured my life into. My blood simmered, but I forced myself to stay calm. Karen thrived on drama, turning every confrontation into a stage for her victimhood. "Karen," I said through gritted teeth, "you have 5 minutes to clear this place out, or I'll call the sheriff." Her hand flew to her chest, a gasp escaping her lips as if I'd threatened her very soul. "How dare you, threatening legal action against your own neighbors? That's so unkind." Her lackeys nodded, glaring at me like I was the villain in their little melodrama, but I held my ground, staring her down as the clock ticked. Karen's theatrics didn't faze me, but her next move tested my restraint. She took a dramatic step forward, her voice dripping with sanctimony as she declared, "We're only using your ranch for a few hours. Besides, what kind of man would refuse to let children experience the joy of horseback riding?" Right on cue, a gaggle of snot-nosed brats darted past, swinging costly riding crops like toys, one smacking a fence post with a crack that made my well-trained horses flick their ears nervously. I could see it unfolding, a yanked rein, a spooked animal, and a lawsuit waiting to happen, all while Karen smirked, daring me to push back. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss only I could hear. "Be reasonable. It's just one day. You really don't want to make enemies with the entire HOA board, do you?" There it was, the veiled threat she'd perfected, the promise of petty vengeance she'd inflicted on others who'd crossed her. I felt the heat rising in my chest, but instead of exploding, I smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that threw her off balance. "Fine," I said, stepping back with a shrug. "You win, Karen. Enjoy your event." Her eyes widened, clearly expecting a fight, not this sudden surrender, and for a moment she faltered, unsure how to handle my compliance. I gave her a friendly nod, turned on my heel, and strolled toward the barn, her confusion trailing behind me like a shadow. The second I was out of sight, I pulled out my phone and dialed Jake, my ranch hand, keeping my voice low. "Jake, I need you to do something for me. Go to the tack room, remove every saddle from those horses, every single one, and replace them with cowbells. The biggest, loudest ones we've got." There was a pause, then Jake's slow chuckle rumbled through the line. "You're a madman," he said, the grin audible in his tone. "Maybe," I replied, peering out as Karen pranced around my property like a self-crowned queen, basking in her imagined triumph. "But it's time she learned what happens when you mess with a rancher." That night, as the HOA crowd dispersed to rest up for their grand showcase, I slipped into the shadows, securing a cowbell to each horse where the saddles had been. A meticulous task, ensuring they were snug enough to stay but loose enough to unleash chaos the moment weight hit them. By sunrise, the stage was set, and the HOA descended again, their crisp riding gear gleaming, noses tilted high as if they were Olympians, not social media posers. Karen stood at the forefront, delivering a pompous speech about heritage and elite equestrian traditions, her voice booming like a politician on the campaign trail. I leaned against the fence, arms crossed, waiting for the fireworks. One by one, the riders mounted their horses, and the second their weight pressed down, the air erupted with a deafening clang of cowbells, metal chaos that sent the animals into a frenzy. The first horse bolted, its rider shrieking. The second bucked, flipping its rider backward into the dirt. Within moments, the entire line was a stampede of panicked hooves and jangling bells, riders tumbling like ragdolls as the crowd gasped and scattered. And there was Karen perched atop the biggest stallion, her smugness morphing into terror as her cowbell rang out, the horse rearing up before launching her into the air, arms flailing, legs kicking, straight toward the manure pile I'd known would be her destiny. The chaos unfolded like a perfectly scripted disaster, the cowbells clanging in a wild symphony as horses galloped in every direction, their riders screaming and flailing in a desperate bid to hold on. Dust clouds billowed across the ranch, mixing with the shrieks of HOA members who'd moments ago been sipping lemonade and snapping selfies, now scrambling to avoid the stampede. One man clung to his horse's neck like a terrified kid on a runaway ride, while a woman in pristine white riding gear toppled sideways into a water trough, her dignity sinking with a splash. The horses, spooked beyond reason, kicked up dirt and mayhem, their hooves pounding the ground as the crowd's gasps turned to yelps of panic. And then there was Karen, astride her towering black stallion, her face a mask of smug superiority, until the cowbell beneath her let loose its loudest clang yet, shattering her composure as the beast reared up with a furious whinny. Her scream pierced the air, a high-pitched wail that could have shattered glass as she clung to the mane, her legs kicking uselessly against the saddleless chaos. The stallion took off at a breakneck pace, weaving through the wreckage of her precious event, toppling tables, sending lemonade cups flying, and scattering finger sandwiches into the dirt like confetti from a failed parade. For a fleeting second, time seemed to slow as the horse veered toward the manure pile, and I watched, heart pounding with wicked anticipation, as Karen's grip faltered. She soared through the air in a glorious arc, arms windmilling, hair whipping in the wind, before landing face first with a sickening squelch in the biggest, stinkiest heap on my ranch. Silence fell heavy and surreal as the dust settled and the horses stilled, their trembling flanks heaving, cowbells dangling like mocking medals of her defeat. Then a single laugh broke the quiet, a stifled chuckle from somewhere in the crowd, followed by another and another, until the entire HOA erupted in unrestrained hysterics, pointing at their fallen queen, now dripping with humiliation and manure. I stepped forward, unable to suppress my grin, and took a deep breath, the sweet scent of justice filling my lungs. "Well," I said, crossing my arms as Karen peeled herself from the muck, her face an alarming shade of red beneath the filth. "Looks like your equestrian event was a real success." Her mouth flapped open and shut, words failing her for once, her hands clenching into fists as she trembled with rage. Without a retort, she turned and stomped off, the squelching of her manure-soaked boots a fitting soundtrack to her exit, leaving the crowd caught between laughter and shock. Kids giggled openly, pointing at her retreating figure, while even the horses seemed to flick their tails in amusement at her downfall. A few of Karen's loyalists tried to rally, offering napkins or a supportive arm, but she swatted them away, a furious cat lashing out at her own minions. "I will not be laughed at," she screeched, her voice cracking with desperation, but the declaration only fueled the snickers rippling through the onlookers. Her wild eyes landed on me, and I braced myself for the inevitable. She jabbed a finger in my direction, shrieking, "This was sabotage. He did this. He replaced the saddles. He's trying to ruin this community." Her accusation hung in the air, as predictable as it was pathetic, and I tilted my head, feigning innocence. "Karen," I said smoothly, "I thought you wanted an authentic ranch experience. We use cowbells all the time. Helps keep track of the animals." Karen's shrill accusation echoed across the ranch, her finger trembling as she pointed at me, her face a twisted mask of fury and manure-streaked humiliation. But I held my ground, my voice calm and steady as I countered her outburst. "Now, Karen," I said, raising a hand to halt her impending tirade, "I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't force anyone to sit on those horses. You planned this event, you told everyone to mount up, and if I recall, you said just sit down and get comfortable, didn't you?" A fresh wave of laughter rolled through the crowd, heads nodding as they remembered her dismissive wave when the first rider had questioned the missing saddles. Her own words, flung back at her, lit a spark of realization among the HOA members. She'd orchestrated her own downfall, and they were starting to see it. The man in the golf polo, still brushing dirt from his slacks, muttered loud enough for others to hear, "You know, she does always act like she owns everything." A woman nearby crossed her arms, her voice sharp with newfound clarity. "Yeah, she didn't even ask permission to use the ranch or tell us where the donation money was going." Another chimed in, "I bet it's all for her next big idea," and the murmurs spread like wildfire, the crowd turning on their one-son-challenged leader. Karen whirled around, her eyes wide with panic as she saw her grip slipping, her power, built on bluster and intimidation, crumbling under the weight of their doubts. "I did this for the community," she bellowed, her voice cracking with desperation. "For all of you, you should be thanking me." A kid, barely 10, pointed at her dripping, manure-covered figure and burst out laughing, shouting, "Thank you for what? The best day ever." That broke the dam. The crowd dissolved into full-blown hysterics, clutching their sides as Karen's reign unraveled before their eyes. I decided it was time to twist the knife. "Well," I said, struggling to keep a straight face, "since the event's wrapping up, I'd be happy to give you all a proper riding lesson, for those who actually want to learn how to handle horses, not just use them as Instagram props." That hit a nerve. A few shifted uncomfortably, their selfie sticks suddenly feeling heavier, while others perked up, intrigued. A woman in a riding helmet shrugged. "Actually, that doesn't sound bad," and another agreed. "If we're doing this, we should learn the right way." More nodded, and I could feel the shift. The HOA wasn't just humoring me, they were questioning Karen's stranglehold. She took a shaky step forward, sputtering, "No, you can't just," but I cut her off smoothly. "I think we can, Karen. You've had a rough day, maybe sit this one out, clean up, go home, take a nice long bath." Her eyes blazed with fury, but she was cornered, her authority in tatters. With no words left, she spun and stormed off, the squelch of her boots punctuating her retreat as the crowd parted, some even clapping as she vanished from sight. A man who'd spent 10 minutes clawing out of a bush limped over, shaking his head with a grin. "That was better than any HOA meeting I've ever been to," he said, and I tipped my hat, replying, "Glad to be of service." The dust settled, and the remaining guests relaxed, some taking up my offer for real lessons, turning the day into something genuine. No banners, no speeches, just people and horses, the way it should be. With Karen gone, the air on the ranch lightened, the tension dissolving as the HOA crowd shifted from stunned spectators to willing participants, their laughter fatting into a hum of curiosity and relief. I spent the afternoon teaching those who stayed behind how to handle horses properly, how to sit steady, guide with a gentle hand, and respect the animals instead of treating them like props for their social media feeds. There were no garish banners flapping in the breeze, no overblown speeches about tradition or community spirit, just the quiet rhythm of hooves on dirt and the occasional chuckle as someone wobbled in the saddle. A woman who'd earlier tumbled into the trough wiped damp hair from her face and grinned, managing a shaky trot by sundown, while the man in the golf polo, bruised but determined, finally sat upright without clutching the mane like a lifeline. It was simple, honest work, and for the first time that day, my ranch felt like mine again. Word of Karen's manure-soaked meltdown spread fast, carried on whispers and gleeful retellings by those who'd witnessed her spectacular fall from grace. In the weeks that followed, The HOA's blind loyalty to her began to crack. People who'd once nodded along to her every decree started pushing back against her absurd rules, their voices growing bolder with each meeting she missed. A few even approached me quietly, hats in hand, offering apologies for going along with her schemes. "We didn't like how she ran things," one woman admitted, her eyes darting as if Karen might still leap out to scold her. "But she'd make life hell if you didn't play along." I nodded, letting them talk, knowing her reign had relied on fear more than respect, and that fear was evaporating like morning dew under the heat of her humiliation. The best news came a month later, trickling through the grapevine like a victory hymn. Karen had been voted out as HOA president. Her manure-drenched debacle had been the final straw, the board deciding they needed someone with a shred of diplomacy instead of a dictator in designer riding gear. To celebrate, I threw another horseback event on my ranch, but this time it was on my terms. Invitations went only to those who respected the land. No HOA cronies or entitled gate crashers allowed. The day was quiet and warm, filled with the soft nickering of horses and the chatter of folks who actually wanted to be there. We rode through the fields, shared a few beers by the barn, and let the kids pet the gentler mares. No cowbells, no chaos, just an honest gathering that felt like a middle finger to Karen's gaudy spectacle. As the sun dipped low, casting golden streaks across the pasture, I caught a glimpse of her. Karen lurking at the edge of my property, peering over the fence with her arms crossed tight, her face pinched with the kind of fury only a dethroned tyrant could muster. She didn't dare step closer, but her presence was a silent tantrum, a refusal to let go of the power she'd lost. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a cowbell I'd kept as a souvenir, and gave it 2 sharp rings, loud, clear, and taunting. Her face flushed a violent red, veins bulging as she glared, but I just smiled and tipped my hat, savoring the moment. She turned and stalked off, disappearing into the dusk, and I knew some people never learn, not even when the lesson lands them face first in a pile of their own making. Karen's ousting didn't erase her entirely from the landscape. She lingered like a stubborn weed, popping up in whispers and sidelong glances from neighbors who'd once trembled under her reign, but the ranch stayed peaceful, a sanctuary reclaimed from her grasping hands. The new HOA president, a quiet man named Tom who favored practical jeans over Karen's ostentatious outfits, took over with a promise to dial back the nonsense. No more surprise events, no more guilt-tripping dues for projects nobody wanted. People noticed the difference fast. Meetings shrank from hours of Karen's bluster to brisk half-hour discussions, and folks started showing up because they wanted to, not because they feared her wrath. My name came up more than once, I heard, half in jest, half in gratitude, as the guy who'd finally toppled the queen, though I waved it off whenever someone tried thanking me in person. The ranch itself thrived in the aftermath, the horses calmer without strangers barging in to slap saddles or cowbells on their backs, and I found a rhythm again, mending fences and tending the herd with Jake, who still grinned every time he passed the tack room. "You think she'll try something else?" he asked one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow as we hauled hay. I shrugged, glancing toward the horizon where her house sat, a distant speck of trouble. "Maybe, but she's got no army now, let her stew." And stew she did. Rumors trickled in that Karen spent her days holed up, plotting comebacks nobody cared to hear, her once loyal cronies scattering to save face or just enjoy the quiet. The pearl-clutching woman who'd gasped at my sheriff threat even joined one of my riding lessons, trading her necklace for a sensible hat and admitting, "I never liked horses till you showed us how." That admission stuck with me. Karen's reign had been built on flash, not substance, and now people were peeling back the layers, finding value in what she'd dismissed. I kept hosting those small gatherings, letting the ranch become a place where folks could ride, laugh, and leave the HOA's old baggage behind. One evening, as the group swapped stories over a crackling fire, a kid who'd been there the day of the gala tugged my sleeve. "You think Karen's still mad about the poop?" he asked, eyes wide. I chuckled, ruffling his hair. "Kid, I think she's mad about a lot more than that, but it's her problem now." The group laughed, the sound carrying into the night, and I felt a quiet pride knowing the land was mine again, not a stage for her ego. But Karen wasn't done haunting me, not quite. Late one afternoon, as I checked the pasture gates, I spotted her car creeping along the road bordering my property, slow and deliberate like a predator sizing up prey. She didn't stop, Didn't wave, just drove past with her eyes locked on the ranch, her silhouette stiff with that same petulant rage I'd seen at the fence. I didn't flinch, let her look, let her fume. I'd beaten her once without raising a fist, and if she came back for round two, I'd be ready. The cowbell stayed in my pocket, a talisman of her defeat, and as her tail lights faded, I turned back to the horses, their steady breathing a reminder of what mattered. She could scheme all she wanted. Out here, she was just noise, and I'd learned how to tune it out. The days stretched into a comfortable routine after Karen's fall, the ranch settling into a quiet groove that felt like a reward for weathering her storm. Horses grazed lazily in the fields, their coats gleaming under the sun, while I patched fences and planned the next ride with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. Tom, the new HOA head, kept things civil, dropping by once to ask if I'd mind a small group using the back trail. Not demanding, just asking, a stark contrast to Karen's imperial decrees. I said yes, and he thanked me with a handshake, not a flyer or a guilt trip, proving the neighborhood could function without her iron grip. Word kept filtering in about her. She'd tried rallying her old allies at a coffee shop meeting, but only a handful showed, and even they looked bored sipping lattes while she ranted about ungrateful traitors. Her power had always been smoke and mirrors, and now the mirrors were cracked. Jake and I took bets on how long she'd sulk before trying something new. He figured a month, I gave her 2. But either way, we kept the ranch running smooth, the cowbell incident a running joke that never got old. One morning, as we mucked stalls, he nodded toward the tack room with a grin. "You ought to frame that bell, boss, call it Karen's crown." I laughed, the sound echoing off the barn walls, and for a moment I considered it, but it stayed in my pocket, a quiet trophy I didn't need to flaunt. The folks who'd stuck around after the gala kept coming back, too, not for clout, but to learn, their boots scuffed from real work instead of polished for show. The woman who'd ditched her pearls brought her husband one weekend, and he turned out to be a decent hand with a bridle, thanking me later over a beer for giving them something real to do together. That authenticity spread, a ripple Karen couldn't stop. People talked less about her equestrian legacy and more about the rides we'd started, the ones where kids giggled atop ponies and adults traded tips instead of dues. One evening, as the sun dipped low, a guy who'd fallen off during the gala clapped me on the shoulder, his limp gone but his grin wide. "Never thought I'd like this place after that mess," he said, "but you made it worth coming back." I nodded, watching the group pack up, their chatter warm against the cooling air, and felt the ranch breathe easier without her shadow looming. Still, she wasn't invisible. Twice more I caught her car crawling past, her glare fixed on the land she couldn't claim, but she never stopped, never spoke, just drove on like a ghost clinging to a grudge. Then came the mail. A crisp envelope from the HOA, no glittery nonsense, just a note saying they dropped the greater community, clause Karen had loved to wield against me, officially recognizing my ranch as private, no strings attached. Tom had pushed it through, and I pictured her fuming when she heard, her last tether to my life snipped clean. I tucked the letter away, a quiet win, and stepped outside to the pasture, the horses lifting their heads as I whistled. The fight was over. She could glare from afar, scheme in her exile, but out here, I'd built something she couldn't touch, and that was enough. The cowbell jingled faintly in my pocket as I walked, a reminder of the day she'd lost, and I smiled, letting the dusk settle around me. The ranch hummed with a quiet victory as spring rolled in, the fields greening up and the horses kicking up their heels like they knew the air was freer without Karen's shadow hanging over us. Her absence felt permanent now, a weight lifted that let the days unfold easy and unhurried. Tom's HOA kept to its word, no more overreach or surprise invasions, just a loose-knit group of neighbors who waved when they passed instead of plotting ways to rope me into their schemes. I heard through the grapevine that Karen had tried one last stand, a petition to reclaim her presidency. But it flopped, barely a dozen signatures scratched onto the page before folks lost interest, leaving her to mutter about betrayal in her overpriced living room. Her car stopped creeping by, too, the road beyond my fence empty of her brooding presence, and I figured she'd finally burned through the last of her spite, or at least pointed it somewhere else. Jake and I kept the place running smooth, the riding sessions growing into a steady thing. Nothing formal, just folks showing up with coffee and questions, learning to saddle up right and laughing when they didn't. The kid who'd mocked Karen's manure dive became a regular, fearless on a pony now, his parents grinning from the fence as he whooped his way across the field. Others followed, shedding their HOA polish for scuffed boots and real smiles, and the ranch turned into something alive, a hub of dirt and sweat and stories that didn't need banners to mean something. One afternoon, the ex-burro lady, now a steady hand with a curry comb, brought a pie, setting it on the barn steps with a shy, "Thanks for all this," and I ate a slice later, the sweetness mixing with the satisfaction of seeing her trade entitlement for effort. Corinne's name faded from the chatter, replaced by talk of trails and tack, though her legend lingered in the cowbell I still carried. A relic of the day she'd flown face first into her own mess, a story folks retold with less malice and more amusement as time wore on. I didn't need to ring it anymore. Its weight in my pocket was enough, a silent nod to the chaos I'd turned into triumph. Then one crisp evening, as I locked the barn after a long ride, a shadow caught my eye. Corinne back at the fence, her arms crossed tight, her face a storm of resentment as she watched the last riders leave, their laughter drifting on the breeze. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there like a statue of her own defeat, and I let her stare, knowing she saw what she'd lost, a community that didn't need her crown. I walked over slow, stopping a few yards off, and met her glare with a calm I'd earned. "Evening, Corinne," I said, pulling the cowbell free and giving it one last, deliberate jingle sharp and clear in the still air. Her lips tightened, her eyes flashing, but she said nothing, just turned and vanished into the dark, her footsteps fading fast. I tucked the bell away, tipped my hat to the empty space she'd left, and headed back to the house, the ranch stretching out quiet and whole around me. She'd never learn, not really, but I didn't care. Out here, I'd won, not with threats or shouts, but with horses and patience and a little bit of noise. The stars winked overhead, the horses settled in their stalls, and I shut the door on her for good, the fight finished, the land mine.